This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boyer. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 29.
The assembly seated, rising o'er the rest, Achilles thus the king of men addressed. Pope's Iliad.
Cora stood foremost among the prisoners, entwining her arms in those of Alice, in the tenderness of sisterly love. Notwithstanding the fearful and menacing array of savages on every side of her, no apprehension on her own account could prevent the nobler-minded maiden from keeping her eyes fastened on the pale and anxious features of the trembling Alice. Close at their side stood Heyward, with an interest in both that, at such a moment of intense uncertainty, scarcely knew a preponderance in favor of her whom he most loved. Hawkeye had placed himself a little in the rear, with a deference to the superior rank of his companions, that no similarity in the state of their present fortunes could induce him to forget. Uncas was not there. When perfect silence was again restored, and after the usual long, impressive pause, one of the two aged chiefs who sat at the side of the patriarch arose, and demanded aloud in very intelligible English, "Which of my prisoners is La Longue Carabine?" Neither Duncan nor the scout answered. The former, however, glanced his eyes around the dark and silent assembly, and recoiled a pace, when they fell on the malignant visage of Magua. He saw at once that this wily savage had some secret agency in their present arraignment before the nation, and determined to throw every possible impediment in the way of the execution of his sinister plans. He had witnessed one instance of the summary punishments of the Indians, and now dreaded that his companion was to be selected for a second. In this dilemma, with little or no time for reflection, he suddenly determined to cloak his invaluable friend, at any or every hazard to himself. Before he had time, however, to speak, the question was repeated in a louder voice, and with a clearer utterance. "Give us arms," the young man haughtily replied, "and place us in yonder woods. Our deeds shall speak for us." "This is the warrior whose name has filled our ears," returned the chief, regarding Heyward with that sort of curious interest which seems inseparable from man, when first beholding one of his fellows to whom merit or accident, virtue or crime, has given notoriety. "What has brought the white man into the camp of the Delawares?" "My necessities. I come for food, shelter, and friends." "It cannot be. The woods are full of game. The head of a warrior needs no other shelter than a sky without clouds, and the Delawares are the enemies, and not the friends of the Yengeese. Go, the mouth had spoken, while the heart said nothing." Duncan, a little at a loss for what manner to proceed, remained silent. But the scout, who had listened attentively to all that had passed, now advanced steadily to the front. "That I did not answer to the call for La Longue Carabine was not owing either to shame or fear," he said, "for neither one nor the other is the gift of an honest man. But I do not admit the right of the Mingos to bestow a name on one whose friends have been mindful of his gifts, in this particular, especially as their title is a lie, Killdeer being a grooved barrel and no carabine. I am the man, however, that got the name of Nathaniel from my kin, the complement of Hawkeye from the Delawares, who live on their own river, and whom the Iroquois have presumed to style the Long Rifle, without any warranty from him who is most concerned in the matter." The eyes of all present, which had hitherto been gravely scanning the person of Duncan, were now turned on the instant toward the upright iron frame of this new pretender to the distinguished appellation. It was in no degree remarkable that there should be found two who were willing to claim so great an honor, for impostors, though rare, were not unknown among the natives. But it was altogether material to the just and severe intentions of the Delawares that there should be no mistake in the matter. Some of their old men consulted together in private, and then, as it would seem, they determined to interrogate their visitor on the subject. "My brother has said that a snake crept into my camp," said the chief to Magua. "Which is he?" The Huron pointed to the scout. "Will a wise Delaware believe the barking of a wolf?" exclaimed Duncan, still more confirmed in the evil intentions of his ancient enemy. "A dog never lies, but when was a wolf known to speak the truth?" The eyes of Magua flashed fire, but suddenly recollecting the necessity of maintaining his presence of mind, he turned away in silent disdain, well assured that the sagacity of the Indians would not fail to extract the real merits of the point in controversy. He was not deceived, for after another short consultation, the wary Delaware turned to him again, and expressed the determination of the chiefs, though in the most considerate language. "My brother has been called a liar," he said, "and his friends are angry. They will show that he has spoken the truth. Give my prisoners guns, and let them prove which is the man." Magua affected to consider the expedient, which he well knew proceeded from distrust of himself, as a compliment, and made a gesture of acquiescence, well content that his veracity should be supported by so skillful a marksman as the scout. The weapons were instantly placed in the hands of their friendly opponents, and they were bid to fire, over the heads of the seated multitude, at an earthen vessel, which lay, by accident, on a stump, some 50 yards from the place where they stood. Heyward smiled on himself at the idea of a competition with the scout, though he determined to persevere in the deception until apprised of the real designs of Magua. Raising his rifle with the utmost care, and renewing his aims 3 several times, he fired. The bullet cut the wood within a few inches of the vessel, and a general exclamation of satisfaction announced that the shot was considered a proof of great skill in the use of a weapon. Even Hawkeye nodded his head, as if he would say it was better than he expected. But instead of manifesting an intention to contend with the successful marksman, he stood leaning on his rifle for more than a minute, like a man who is completely buried in thought. From this reverie he was, however, awakened by one of the young Indians who had furnished the arms, and who now touched his shoulder, saying in exceedingly broken English, "Can the pale-face beat it?" "Yes, Huron," exclaimed the scout, raising the short rifle in his right hand, and shaking it at Magua, with as much apparent ease as if it were a reed. "Yes, Huron, I could strike you now, and no power on earth could prevent the deed. The soaring hawk is not more certain of the dove than I am this moment of you, did I choose to send a bullet to your heart. Why should I not? Why? Because the gifts of my color forbid it, and I might draw down evil on tender and innocent heads. If you know such a being as God, thank him, therefore, in your inward soul, for you have reason." The flushed countenance, angry eye, and swelling figure of the scout produced a sensation of secret awe in all that heard him. The Delawares held their breath in expectation, but Magua himself, even while he distrusted the forbearance of his enemy, remained immovable and calm where he stood wedged in by the crowd, as one who grew to the spot. "Beat it!" repeated the young Delaware at the elbow of the scout. "Beat what, fool? What?" exclaimed Hawkeye, still flourishing the weapon angrily above his head, though his eye no longer sought the person of Magua. "If the white man is the warrior he pretends," said the aged chief, "let him strike nigher to the mark." The scout laughed aloud, a noise that produced the startling effect of an unnatural sound on Heyward. Then, dropping the piece heavily into his extended left hand, it was discharged, apparently by the shock, driving the fragments of the vessel into the air, and scattering them on every side. Almost at the same instant, the rattling sound of the rifle was heard, as he suffered it to fall contemptuously to the earth. The first impression of so strange a scene was engrossing admiration. Then a low but increasing murmur ran through the multitude, and finally swelled into sounds that denoted a lively opposition in the sentiments of the spectators, while some openly testified their satisfaction at so unexampled dexterity. By far the larger portion of the tribe were inclined to believe the success of the shot was the result of accident. Heyward was not slow to confirm an opinion that was so favorable to his own pretensions. "It was chance," he exclaimed. "None can shoot without an aim." "Chance," echoed the excited woodsman, who was now stubbornly bent on maintaining his identity at every hazard, and on whom the secret hints of Heyward to acquiesce in the deception were entirely lost. "Does yonder lying Huron, too, think it chance? Give him another gun, and place us face to face without cover or dodge, and let Providence and our own eyes decide the matter atween us. I do not make the offer to you, Major, for our blood is of a color, and we serve the same master." "That the Huron is a liar is very evident," returned Heyward coolly. "You have yourself heard him assert you to be La Longue Carabine." It were impossible to say what violent assertion the stubborn Hawkeye would have next made, in his headlong wish to vindicate his identity, had not the aged Delaware once more interposed. "The hawk which comes from the clouds can return when he will," he said. "Give them the guns." This time the scout seized the rifle with avidity, nor had Magua, though he watched the movements of the marksman with jealous eyes, any further cause for apprehension. "Now let it be proved in the face of this tribe of Delawares which is the better man," cried the scout, tapping the butt of his piece with that finger which had pulled so many fatal triggers. "You see that gourd hanging against yonder tree, Major? If you are a marksman fit for the borders, let me see you break its shell." Duncan noted the object, and prepared himself to renew the trial. The gourd was one of the usual little vessels used by the Indians, and it was suspended from a dead branch of a small pine, by a thong of deerskin, at the full distance of 100 yards. So strangely compounded is the feeling of self-love, that the young soldier, while he knew the utter worthlessness of the suffrages of his savage umpires, forgot the sudden motives of the contest in a wish to excel. It had been seen already that his skill was far from being contemptible, and he now resolved to put forth its nicest qualities. Had his life depended on the issue, the aim of Duncan could not have been more deliberate or guarded. He fired, and 3 or 4 young Indians, who sprang forward at the report, announced with a shout that the ball was in the tree, a very little on one side of the proper object. The warriors uttered a common ejaculation of pleasure, and then turned their eyes inquiringly on the movements of his rival. "It may do for the Royal Americans," said Hawkeye, laughing once more in his own silent, heartfelt manner. "But had my gun often turned so much from the true line, many a Martin, whose skin is now in a lady's muff, would still be in the woods. Ay, and a many bloody Mingo, who is departed to his final account, would be acting his deviltries at this very day atween the provinces. I hope the squaw who owns the gourd has more of them in her wigwam, for this will never hold water again." The scout had shook his priming, and cocked his piece while speaking, and, as he ended, he threw back a foot, and slowly raised the muzzle from the earth. The motion was steady, uniform, and in one direction. When on a perfect level it remained for a single moment, without tremor or variation, as though both man and rifle were carved in stone. During that stationary instant it poured forth its contents in a bright glancing sheet of flame. Again the young Indians bounded forward, but their hurried search and disappointed looks announced that no traces of the bullet were to be seen. "Go," said the old chief to the scout, in a tone of strong disgust. "Thou art a wolf in the skin of a dog. I will talk to the long rifle of Yengeese." "Ah, had I that piece which furnished the name you see, I would obligate myself to cut the thong and drop the gourd without breaking it," returned Hawkeye, perfectly undisturbed by the other's manners. "Fools! If you would find the bullet of a sharpshooter in these woods, you must look in the object, and not around it." The Indian youth instantly comprehended his meaning, for this time he spoke in the Delaware tongue, and tearing the gourd from the tree, they held it on high with an exulting shout, displaying a hole in its bottom, which had been cut by the bullet after passing through the usual orifice in the center of its upper side. At this unexpected exhibition, a loud and vehement expression of pleasure burst from the mouth of every warrior present. It decided the question, and effectually established Hawkeye in the possession of his dangerous reputation. Those curious and admiring eyes, which had been turned again on Heyward, were finally directed to the weather-beaten form of the scout, who immediately became the principal object of attention to the simple and unsophisticated beings by whom he was surrounded. When the sudden and noisy commotion had a little subsided, the aged chief resumed his examination. "Why did you wish to stop my ears?" he said, addressing Duncan. "Are the Delawares fools that they could not know the young panther from the cat?" "They will yet find the Huron a singing bird," said Duncan, endeavoring to adopt the figurative language of the natives. "It is good. We will know who can shut the ears of men. Brother," added the chief, turning his eyes on Magua, "the Delawares listen." Thus singled, and directly called on to declare his object, the Huron arose, and advancing with great deliberation and dignity into the very center of the circle, where he stood confronted by the prisoners, he placed himself in an attitude to speak. Before opening his mouth, however, he bent his eyes slowly along the whole living boundary of earnest faces, as if to temper his expressions to the capacities of his audience. On Hawkeye he cast a glance of respectful enmity. On Duncan a look of inextinguishable hatred. The shrinking figure of Alice he scarcely deigned to notice. But when his glance met the firm, commanding, and yet lovely form of Cora, his eye lingered a moment, with an expression that it might have been difficult to define. Then, filled with his own dark intentions, he spoke in the language of the Canadas, a tongue that he knew well was comprehended by most of his auditors. "The spirit that made men colored them differently," commenced the subtle Huron. "Some are blacker than the sluggish bear. These, he said, should be slaves, and he ordered them to work forever, like the beaver. You may hear them groan when the south wind blows, louder than the lowing buffaloes, along the shores of the Great Salt Lake, where the big canoes come and go with them in droves. Some he made with faces paler than the ermine of the forests, and these he ordered to be traders, dogs to their women, and wolves to their slaves. He gave this people the nature of the pigeon, wings that never tire, young, more plentiful than the leaves on the trees, and appetites to devour the earth. He gave them tongues like the false call of the wildcat, hearts like rabbits, the cunning of the hog, but none of the fox, and arms longer than the legs of the moose. With his tongue he stops the ears of the Indians. His heart teaches him to pay warriors to fight his battles. His cunning tells him how to get together the goods of the earth, and his arms enclose the land from the shores of the salt water to the islands of the great lake. His gluttony makes him sick. God gave him enough, and yet he wants all. Such are the pale-faces. Some the Great Spirit made with skins brighter and redder than yon sun," continued Magua, pointing impressively upward to the lurid luminary, which was struggling through the misty atmosphere of the horizon. "And these did he fashion to his own mind. He gave them this island as he had made it, covered with trees and filled with game. The wind made their clearings, the sun and rain ripened their fruits, and the snows came to tell them to be thankful. What need had they of roads to journey by? They saw through the hills. When the beavers worked, they lay in the shade and looked on. The winds cooled them in summer. In winter, skins kept them warm. If they fought among themselves, it was to prove that they were men. They were brave. They were just. They were happy." Here the speaker paused and looked again around him to discover if his legend had touched the sympathies of his listeners. He met everywhere, with eyes riveted on his own, heads erect and nostrils expanded, as if each individual present felt himself able and willing, singly, to redress the wrongs of his race. "If the Great Spirit gave different tongues to his red children," he continued, in a low, still, melancholy voice, "it was all that animals might understand them. Some he placed among the snows, with their cousin the bear. Some he placed near the setting sun, on the road to the happy hunting grounds. Some on the lands around the great fresh waters. But to his greatest and most beloved he gave the sands of the salt lake. Do my brothers know the name of this favored people?" "It was the Lenape!" exclaimed 20 eager voices in a breath. "It was the Lenape," returned Magua, affecting to bend his head in reverence to their former greatness. "It was the tribes of the Lenape. The sun rose from water that was salt, and set in water that was sweet, and never hid himself from their eyes. But why should I, a Huron of the woods, tell a wise people their own traditions? Why remind them of their injuries, their ancient greatness, their deeds, their glory, their happiness, their losses, their defeats, their misery? Is there not one among them who has seen it all, and who knows it to be true? I have done. My tongue is still, for my heart is of lead. I listen." As the voice of the speaker suddenly ceased, every face and all eyes turned, by a common movement, toward the venerable Temenin. From the moment that he took his seat until the present instant, the lips of the patriarch had not severed, and scarcely a sign of life had escaped him. He sat bent in feebleness, and apparently unconscious of the presence he was in, during the whole of that opening scene in which the skill of the scout had been so clearly established. At the nicely graduated sound of Magua's voice, however, he betrayed some evidence of consciousness, and once or twice he even raised his head, as if to listen. But when the crafty Huron spoke of his nation by name, the eyelids of the old man raised themselves, and he looked out upon the multitude with that sort of dull, unmeaning expression which might be supposed to belong to the countenance of a spectre. Then he made an effort to rise, and being upheld by his supporters, he gained his feet, in a posture commanding by its dignity, while he tottered with weakness. "Who calls upon the children of the Lenape?" he said in a deep guttural voice, that was rendered awfully audible by the breathless silence of the multitude. "Who speaks of things gone? Does not the egg become a worm, the worm a fly, and perish? Why tell the Delawares of good that is past? Better thank the Manitou for that which remains." "It is a Wyandot," said Magua, stepping nigher to the rude platform on which the other stood, "a friend of Temenin." "A friend," repeated the sage, on whose brow a dark frown settled, imparting a portion of that severity which had rendered his eye so terrible in middle age. "Are the Mingos rulers of the earth? What brings a Huron in here?" "Justice. His prisoners are with his brothers, and he comes for his own." Temenin turned his head toward one of his supporters, and listened to the short explanation the man gave. Then, facing the applicant, he regarded him a moment with deep attention, after which he said in a low and reluctant voice, "Justice is the law of the great Manitou. My children, give the stranger food. Then, Huron, take thine own and depart." On the delivery of this solemn judgment the patriarch seated himself, and closed his eyes again, as if better pleased with the images of his own ripened experience than with the visible objects of the world. Against such a decree there was no Delaware sufficiently hardy to murmur, much less oppose himself. The words were barely uttered when 4 or 5 of the younger warriors, stepping behind Heyward and the scout, passed thongs so dexterously and rapidly around their arms as to hold them both in instant bondage. The former was too much engrossed with his precious and nearly insensible burden to be aware of their intentions before they were executed, and the latter, who considered even the hostile tribes of the Delawares a superior race of beings, admitted without resistance. Perhaps, however, the manner of the scout would not have been so passive had he fully comprehended the language in which the preceding dialogue had been conducted. Magua cast a look of triumph around the whole assembly before he proceeded to the execution of his purpose. Perceiving that the men were unable to offer any resistance, he turned his looks on her he valued most. Cora met his gaze with an eye so calm and firm that his resolution wavered. Then, recollecting his former artifice, he raised Alice from the arms of the warrior against whom she leaned, and beckoning Heyward to follow, he motioned for the encircling crowd to open. But Cora, instead of obeying the impulse he had expected, rushed to the feet of the patriarch, and raising her voice, exclaimed aloud, "Just and venerable Delaware, on thy wisdom and power we lean for mercy. Be deaf to yonder artful and remorseless monster, who poisoned thy ears with falsehoods to feed his thirst for blood. Thou that hast lived long, and thou that hast seen the evil of the world, should know how to temper its calamities to the miserable." The eyes of the old man opened heavily, and he once more looked upward at the multitude. As the piercing tones of the supplicant swelled on his ears, they moved slowly in the direction of her person, and finally settled there in a steady gaze. Cora had cast herself to her knees, and with hands clenched in each other and pressed upon her bosom, she remained like a beauteous and breathing model of her sex, looking up in his faded but majestic countenance, with a species of holy reverence. Gradually the expression of Temenin's features changed, and losing their vacancy in admiration, they alighted with a portion of that intelligence which a century before had been wont to communicate his youthful fire to the extensive bands of the Delawares. Rising without assistance, and seemingly without an effort, he demanded, in a voice that startled its auditors by its firmness, "What art thou?" "A woman, one of a hated race, if thou wilt, a Yengee, but one who has never harmed thee, and who cannot harm thy people if she would, who asks for succor." "Tell me, my children," continued the patriarch hoarsely, motioning to those around him, though his eyes still dwelt upon the kneeling form of Cora, "where have the Delawares camped?" "In the mountains of the Iroquois, behind the clear springs of the Huron." "Many parching summers are come and gone," continued the sage, "since I drank of the waters of my own rivers. The children of Minquan are the justest white men, but they were thirsty, and they took it to themselves. Do they follow us so far?"
Footnote: William Penn was termed Minquan by the Delawares, and, as he never used violence or injustice in his dealings with them, his reputation for probity passed into a proverb. The American is justly proud of the origin of his nation, which is perhaps unequalled in the history of the world. But the Pennsylvanian and Jerseyman have more reason to value themselves in their ancestors than the natives of any other state, since no wrong was done the original owners of the soil. End footnote.
"We follow none, we covet nothing," answered Cora. "Captives against our wills have we been brought amongst you, and we ask but permission to part to our own in peace. Art thou not Tamenund, the father, the judge, I had almost said the prophet, of this people?" "I am Tamenund of many days." "'Tis now some 7 years that one of my people was at the mercy of a white chief on the borders of this province. He claimed to be of the blood of the good and just Tamenund. Go, said the white man, for thy parents' sake thou art free. Dost thou remember the name of that English warrior?" "I remember that, when a laughing boy," returned the patriarch with a peculiar recollection of vast age, "I stood upon the sands of the seashore, and saw a big canoe, with wings whiter than the swans, and whiter than many eagles, come from the rising sun." "Nay, nay, I speak not of a time so very distant, but of favor shown to thy kindred by one of mine, within the memory of thy youngest warrior." "Was it when the Yengeese and the Dutchmen fought for the hunting grounds of the Delawares? When Tamenund was a chief, and first laid aside the bow for the lightning of the pale faces?" "Not yet then," interrupted Cora, "by many ages. I speak of a thing of yesterday, Surely, surely you forget it not." "It was but yesterday," rejoined the aged man with touching pathos, "that the children of the Lenape were masters of the world, the fishes of the salt lake, the birds, the beasts, and the Mingi of the woods owned them for sagamores." Cora bowed her head in disappointment, and for a bitter moment struggled with her chagrin. Then, elevating her rich features and beaming eyes, she continued, in tones scarcely less penetrating than the unearthly voice of the patriarch himself, "Tell me, is Tamenund a father?" The old man looked down upon her from his elevated stand, with a benign smile on his wasted countenance, and then, casting his eyes slowly over the whole assemblage, he answered, "Of a nation." "For myself I ask nothing. Like thee and thine, venerable chief," she continued, pressing her hands convulsively on her heart, and suffering her head to droop until her burning cheeks were nearly concealed in the maze of dark, glossy tresses that fell in disorder upon her shoulders. "The curse of my ancestors has fallen heavily on their child. But yonder is one who has never known the weight of heaven's displeasure until now. She is the daughter of an old and failing man, whose days are near their close. She has many, very many, who love her and delight in her, and she is too good, much too precious, to become the victim of that villain. I know that the pale faces are a proud and hungry race. I know that they claim not only to have the earth, but that the meanest of their color is better than the sachems of the red man. The dogs and crows of their tribes," continued the earnest old chieftain, without heeding the wounded spirit of his listener, whose head was nearly crushed to the earth in shame, as he proceeded, "would bark and caw before they would take a woman to their wigwams, whose blood was not the color of snow. But let them not boast before the face of the Manitou too loud. They entered the land at the rising, and may yet go off at the setting sun. Often seen the locusts strip the leaves from the trees, but the season of blossoms has always come again." "It is so," said Cora, drawing a long breath as if reviving from a trance, raising her face, and shaking back her shining veil, with a kindling eye that contradicted the death-like paleness of her countenance. "But why? It is not permitted us to inquire. There's yet one of thine own people who has not been brought before thee. Before thou lettest the Huron depart in triumph, hear him speak." Observing Tamenund to look about him doubtingly, one of his companions said, "It is a snake, a redskin in the pay of the Yengeese. We keep him for the torture." "Let him come," returned the sage. Then Tamenund once more sank into his seat, and a silence so deep prevailed while the young man prepared to obey his simple mandate, that the leaves which fluttered in the draught of the light morning air were distinctly heard rustling in the surrounding forest. End of chapter 29.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melissa. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 30. If you deny me, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer! Shall I have it? Merchant of Venice. The silence continued unbroken by human sounds for many anxious minutes. Then the waving multitude opened and shut again, and Uncas stood in the living circle. All those eyes which had been curiously studying the lineaments of the sage, as the source of their own intelligence, turned on the instant, and were now bent in secret admiration on the erect, agile, and faultless person of the captive. But neither the presence in which he found himself, nor the exclusive attention that he attracted, in any manner disturbed the self-possession of the young Mohican. He cast a deliberate and observing look on every side of him, meeting the settled expression of hostility that lowered in the visages of the chiefs with the same calmness as the curious gaze of the attentive children. But when, last in his haughty scrutiny, the person of Tamenund came under his glance, his eye became fixed, as though all other objects were already forgotten. Then advancing with a slow and noiseless step up to the area, he placed himself immediately before the footstool of the sage. Here he stood unnoted, though keenly observant himself, until one of the chiefs apprised the latter of his presence. "With what tongue does the prisoner speak to the Manitou?" demanded the patriarch without unclosing his eyes. "Like his father," Uncas replied, "with the tongue of a Delaware." At this sudden and unexpected annunciation, a low, fierce yell ran through the multitude, that might not inaptly be compared to the growl of the lion, as his caller is first awakened, a fearful omen of the weight of his further anger. The effect was equally strong on the sage, though differently exhibited. He passed a hand before his eyes, as if to exclude the least evidence of so shameful a spectacle, while he repeated in his low, guttural tones, the words he had just heard. "A Delaware? I have lived to see the tribes of the Lenape driven from their council fires and scattered, like broken herds of deer among the hills of the Iroquois. I have seen the hatchets of the strong people sweep woods from the valleys, that the winds of heaven have spared. The beasts that run on the mountains and the birds that fly above the trees have I seen living in the wigwams of men, but never before have I found a Delaware so base as to creep, like a poisonous serpent, into the camps of his own nation." "The singing birds have opened their bills," returned Uncas, in the softest notes of his own musical voice, "and Tamenund has heard their song." The sage started and bent his head aside, as if to catch the fleeting sounds of some passing melody. "Does Tamenund dream?" he exclaimed. "What voice is at his ear? Have the winters gone backward? Will summer come again to the children of the Lenape?" A solemn and respectful silence succeeded this incoherent burst from the lips of the Delaware prophet. His people readily constructed his unintelligible language into one of those mysterious conferences he was believed to hold so frequently with a superior intelligence, and they awaited the issue of the revelation in awe. After a patient pause, however, one of the aged men, perceiving that the sage had lost the recollection of the subject before them, ventured to remind him again of the presence of the prisoner. "The false Delaware trembles lest he should hear the words of Tamenund," he said. "'Tis a hound that howls when the Yengeese show him a trail." "And ye," returned Uncas, looking sternly about him, "are dogs that whine when the Frenchman casts ye the offals of his deer." 20 knives gleamed in the air, and as many warriors sprang to their feet at this biting and perhaps merited retort; but a motion from one of the chiefs suppressed the outbreaking of the tempers, and restored the appearance of quiet. The task might probably have been more difficult, had not a movement made by Tamenund indicated that he was again about to speak. "Delaware," resumed the sage, "little art thou worthy of thy name. My people have not seen a bright sun in many winters, and the warrior who deserts his tribe when hid in clouds is doubly a traitor. The law of the Manitou is just. It is so, while the rivers run and the mountains stand, while the blossoms come and go on the trees, it must be so. He is thine, my children. Deal justly by him." Not a limb was moved, nor was a breath drawn louder and longer than common, until the closing syllable of this final decree had passed the lips of Tamenund. Then a cry of vengeance burst at once, as it might be, from the united lips of the nation, a frightful augury of their ruthless intentions. In the midst of these prolonged and savage yells, a chief proclaimed, in a high voice, that the captive was condemned to endure the dreadful trial of torture by fire. The circle broke its order, and screams of delight mingled with the bustle and tumult of preparation. Heyward struggled madly with his captors. The anxious eye of Hawkeye began to look around him, with an expression of peculiar earnestness, and Cora again threw herself at the feet of the patriarch, once more a suppliant for mercy. Throughout the whole of these trying moments, Uncas had alone preserved his serenity. He looked on the preparations with a steady eye, and when the tormentors came to seize him, he met them with a firm and upright attitude. One among them, if possible more fierce and savage than his fellows, seized the hunting shirt of the young warrior, and at a single effort tore it from his body. Then, with a yell of frantic pleasure, he leaped toward his unresisting victim, and prepared to lead him to the stake. But at that moment, when he appeared most a stranger to the feelings of humanity, the purpose of the savage was arrested as suddenly as if a supernatural agency had interposed on the behalf of Uncas. The eyeballs of the Delaware seemed to start from their sockets, his mouth opened, and his whole form became frozen in an attitude of amazement. Raising his hand with a slow and regulated motion, he pointed with a finger to the bosom of the captive. His companions crowded about him in wonder, and every eye was like his own, fastened intently on the figure of a small tortoise, beautifully tattooed on the breast of the prisoner, in a bright blue tint. For a single instant, Uncas enjoyed his triumph, smiling calmly on the scene. Then, motioning the crowd away with a high and haughty sweep of his arm, he advanced in front of the nation with the air of a king, and spoke in a voice louder than the murmur of admiration that ran through the multitude. "Men of the Lenni Lenape," he said, "my race upholds the earth. Your feeble tribe stands on a shell. What fire that a Delaware can light could burn the child of my fathers?" he added, pointing proudly to the simple blazonry on his skin. "The blood that came from such a stock would smother your flames. My race is the grandfather of nations." "Who art thou?" demanded Tamenund, rising at the startling tones he heard, more than at any meaning conveyed by the language of the prisoner. "Uncas, the son of Chingachgook," answered the captive modestly, turning from the nation and bending his head in reverence to the other's character and years. "A son of the great Unamis (Turtle)." "Hour of Tamenund is nigh!" exclaimed the sage. "The day is come at last to the night. I thank the Manitou that one is here to fill my place at the council fire. Uncas, the child of Uncas, is found. Let the eyes of a dying eagle gaze on the rising sun." The youth stepped lightly but proudly on the platform, where he became visible to the whole agitated and wondering multitude. Tamenund held him long at the length of his arm, and read every turn, in the fine lineaments of his countenance, with the untiring gaze of one who recalled days of happiness. "Is Tamenund a boy?" at length the bewildered prophet exclaimed. "Have I dreamed of so many snows? That my people were scattered like floating sands? Of Yengeese, more plenty than the leaves of the trees? The arrow of Tamenund would not frighten the fawn. His arm is withered like the branch of a dead oak. The snail would be swifter in the race. Yet is Uncas before him as they went to battle against the pale faces. Uncas, the panther of his tribe, the eldest son of the Lenape, the wisest Sagamore of the Mohicans. Tell me, ye Delawares, has Tamenund been a sleeper for 100 winters?" The calm and deep silence which succeeded these words sufficiently announced the awful reverence with which his people received the communication of the patriarch. None dared to answer, though all listened in breathless expectation of what might follow. Uncas, however, looking in his face with the fondness and veneration of a favored child, presumed on his own high and acknowledged rank to reply. "4 warriors of his race have lived and died," he said, "since the friend of Tamenund led his people in battle. The blood of the turtle has been in many chiefs, but all have gone back into the earth from whence they came, save Chingachgook and his son." "It is true, it is true," returned the sage, a flash of recollection destroying all his pleasing fancies and restoring him at once to a consciousness of the true history of his nation. "Our wise men have often said that 2 warriors of the unchanged race were in the hills of the Yengeese. Why have their seats at the council fires of the Delawares been so long empty?" At these words the young man raised his head, which he had still kept bowed a little in reverence, and lifting his voice so as to be heard by the multitude, as if to explain at once and forever the policy of his family, he said aloud: "Once we slept where we could hear the salt lake speak in its anger. Then we were rulers and sagamores over the land. But when a pale face was seen on every brook, we followed the deer back to the river of our nation. The Delawares were gone. Few warriors of them all stayed to drink of the stream they loved. Then said my fathers, 'Here we will hunt. The waters of the river go into the salt lake. If we go towards the setting sun, we shall find streams that run into the great lakes of sweet water. There would a Mohican die, like fishes of the sea in the clear springs. When the Manitou is ready and shall say, 'Come,' we will follow the river to the sea, and take our own again. Such, Delawares, is the belief of the children of the Turtle. Our eyes are on the rising and not toward the setting sun. We know whence he comes. We know not whither he goes. It is enough." The men of the Lenape listened to his words with all the respect that superstition could lend, finding a secret charm even in the figurative language with which the young Sagamore imparted his ideas. Uncas himself watched the effect of his brief explanation with intelligent eyes, and gradually dropped the air of authority he had assumed, as he perceived that his auditors were content. Then, permitting his looks to wander over the silent throng that crowded around the elevated seat of Tamenund, he first perceived Hawkeye in his bonds. Stepping eagerly from his stand, he made way for himself to the side of his friend, and cutting his thongs with a quick and angry stroke of his own knife, he motioned to the crowd to divide. The Indians silently obeyed, and once more they stood ranged in their circle, as before his appearance among them. Uncas took the scout by the hand and led him to the feet of the patriarch. "Father," he said, "look at this pale-face, a just man and the friend of the Delawares." "Is he a son of Menquon?" "Not so. A warrior known to the Yengeese, and feared by the Maquas." "What name has he gained by his deeds?" "We call him Hawkeye," Uncas replied, using the Delaware phrase, "for his sight never fails. The Mingoes know him better by the death he gives their warriors. With him, he is the long rifle." "La longue carabine?" exclaimed Tamenund, opening his eyes and regarding the scout sternly. "My son has not done well to call him a friend." "I call him so who proves himself such," returned the young chief, with great calmness, but with a steady mien. "If Uncas is welcome among the Delawares, then is Hawkeye with his friends. The pale-face has slain my young men. His name is great for the blows he has struck the Lenape." "If a Mingo has whispered that much in the ear of the Delaware, he has only shown that he is a singing bird," said the scout, who now believed that it was time to vindicate himself from such offensive charges, and who spoke as the man he addressed, modifying his Indian figures, however, with his own peculiar notions. "That I have slain the Maquas I am not the man to deny, even at their own council fires; but that knowingly my hand has ever harmed a Delaware, is opposed to the reasons of my gifts, which is friendly to them and all that belongs to their nation." A low exclamation of applause passed among the warriors, who exchanged looks with each other like men that first begin to perceive their error. "Where is the Huron?" demanded Tamenund. "Has he stopped my ears?" Magua, whose feelings during that scene in which Uncas had triumphed may be much better imagined than described, answered to the call by stepping boldly in front of the patriarch. "The just Tamenund," he said, "will not keep what a Huron has lent." "Tell me, my brother," returned the sage, avoiding the dark countenance of Le Subtil, and turning gladly to the more ingenuous features of Uncas, "has the stranger a conqueror's right over you?" "He has none. The panther may get into snares set by the women, but he is strong, and knows how to leap through them." "La longue carabine?" "Laughs at the Mingoes. Go, Huron, ask your squaws the color of a bear." "The stranger and white maiden that come into my camp together?" "Should journey on an open path." "And the woman that Huron left with my warriors?" Uncas made no reply. "And the woman that the Mingo has brought into my camp?" repeated Tamenund gravely. "She is mine!" cried Magua, shaking his hand in triumph at Uncas. "Mohican, you know that she is mine!" "My son is silent," said Tamenund, endeavoring to read the expression of the face that the youth turned from him in sorrow. "It is so," was the low answer. A short and impressive pause succeeded, during which it was very apparent with what reluctance the multitude admitted the justice of the Mingo's claim. At length the sage, on whom alone the justice depended, said in a firm voice, "Huron, depart." "As he came, just Tamenund?" demanded the wily Magua. "Or with hands filled with the faith of the Delawares? The wigwam of Le Renard Subtil is empty. Make him strong with his own." The aged man mused with himself for a time, and then bending his head toward one of his venerable companions, he asked, "Are my ears open?" "It is true." "Is this Mingo a chief?" "The first in his nation." "Girl, what wouldst thou? A great warrior takes thee to wife. Go, thy race will not end." "Better 1,000 times that it should," exclaimed the horror-struck Cora, "than meet with such a degradation."
"Huron, her mind is in the tents of her fathers. An unwilling maiden makes an unhappy wigwam."
"She speaks with the tongue of her people," returned Magua, regarding his victim with a look of bitter irony. "She is of the race of traitors, and will bargain for a bright look. Let Tamenund speak the words."
"Take you the wampum and our love."
"Nothing hence but what Magua brought hither."
"Then depart with thine own. The great Manitou forbids that a Delaware should be unjust."
Magua advanced and seized his captain strongly by the arm. The Delawares fell back in silence, and Cora, as if conscious that remonstrance would be useless, prepared to submit to her fate without resistance. "Hold! hold!" cried Duncan, springing forward. Huron, have mercy! Her ransom shall make thee richer than any of thy people were ever yet known to be. Magua is a redskin. He wants not the beads of the pale-faces. Gold, silver, power, lead, all that a warrior needs shall be in thy wigwam, all that becomes the greatest chief." "Le Subtil is very strong," cried Magua, violently shaking the hand which grasped the unresisting arm of Cora. "He has his revenge." "Mighty ruler of Providence!" exclaimed Heyward, clasping his hands together in agony, "can this be suffered? To you, just Tamenund, I appeal for mercy." "The words of the Delaware are said," returned the sage, closing his eyes, and dropping back into his seat, alike wearied with his mental and his bodily exertion. "Men speak not twice." "That a chief should not misspend his time in unsaying what has once been spoken is wise and reasonable," said Hawkeye, motioning to Duncan to be silent; "but it is also prudent in every warrior to consider well before he strikes his tomahawk into the head of his prisoner. Huron, I love you not, nor can I say that any Mingo has ever received much favor at my hands. It is fair to conclude that, if this war does not soon end, many more of your warriors will meet me in the woods. Put it to your judgment, then, whether you would prefer taking such a prisoner as that into your encampment, or one like myself, who am a man that it would greatly rejoice your nation to see with naked hands." "Will the Long Rifle give his life for the woman?" demanded Magua, hesitatingly, for he had already made a motion toward quitting the place with his victim. "No, I have not said so much as that," returned Hawkeye, drawing back with suitable discretion, when he noted the eagerness with which Magua listened to his proposal. "It would be an unequal exchange, to give a warrior in the prime of his life and usefulness for the best woman on the frontiers. I might consent to go into winter quarters now, at least 6 weeks before the leaves will turn, on condition you will release the maiden." Magua shook his head and made an impatient sign for the crowd to open. "Well, then," added the scout, with the musing air of a man who had not half made up his mind, "I will throw killdeer into the bargain. Take the word of an experienced hunter, the peace is not its equal atween the provinces." Magua still disdained to reply, continuing his efforts to disperse the crowd. "Perhaps," added the scout, losing his dissembled coolness exactly in proportion as the other manifested an indifference to the exchange, "if I should condition to teach your young men the real virtue of the weapon, it would smooth the little differences in our judgments." Le Renard fiercely ordered the Delawares, who still lingered in an impenetrable belt around him, in hopes he would listen to the amicable proposal, to open his path, threatening, by the glance of his eye, another appeal to the infallible justice of their prophet. "What is ordered must sooner or later arrive," continued Hawkeye, turning with a sad and humbled look to Uncas. "The varlet knows his advantage, and will keep it. God bless you, boy! You have found friends among your natural kin, and I hope they will prove as true as some you have met who had no Indian cross. As for me, sooner or later, I must die. It is, therefore, fortunate there are but few to make my death howl. After all, it is likely the imps would have managed to master my scalp, so a day or two will make no great difference in the everlasting reckoning of time. God bless you," added the rugged woodsman, bending his head aside, and then instantly changing his direction again, with a wistful look toward the youth. "I loved both you and your father, Uncas, though our skins were not altogether of a color, and our gifts are somewhat different. Tell the Sagamore I never lost sight of him in my greatest trouble; and as for you, think of me sometimes when on a lucky trail, and depend on it, boy, whether there be one heaven or two, there is a path in the other world by which honest men may come together again. You'll find the rifle in the place we hid it. Take it, and keep it for my sake; and harkee, lad, as your natural gifts don't deny you the use of vengeance, use it a little freely on the Mingoes. It may unburden griefs at my loss, and ease your mind. Huron, I accept your offer. Release the woman. I am your prisoner." A suppressed but still distinct murmur of approbation ran through the crowd at this generous proposition, even the fiercest among the Delaware warriors manifesting pleasure at the manliness of the intended sacrifice. Magua paused, and for an anxious moment, it might be said, he doubted. Then casting his eyes on Cora, with an expression in which ferocity and admiration were strangely mingled, his purpose became fixed forever. He intimated his contempt of the offer with a backward motion of his head, and said in a steady and settled voice: "Le Renard Subtil is a great chief. He has but one mind. Come," he added, laying his hand too familiarly on the shoulder of his captive to urge her onward, "a Huron is no tattler. We will go." The maiden drew back in lofty womanly reserve, and her dark eye kindled, while the rich blood shot, like the passing brightness of the sun, into her very temples at the indignity. "I am your prisoner, and at a fitting time shall be ready to follow, even to my death; but violence is unnecessary," she coldly said, and immediately turning to Hawkeye, added, "Generous hunter, from my soul I thank you. Your offer is vain, neither could it be accepted; but still you may serve me, even more than in your own noble intention. Look at that drooping, humbled child; abandon her not until you leave her in the habitations of civilized men. I will not say," wringing the hard hand of the scout, "that her father will reward you, for such as you are above the rewards of men, but he will thank you and bless you. And believe me, the blessing of a just and aged man has virtue in the sight of Heaven. Would to God I could hear one word from his lips at this awful moment." Her voice became choked, and for an instant she was silent. Then, advancing a step nigher to Duncan, who was supporting her unconscious sister, she continued in more subdued tones, but in which feelings and the habits of her sex maintained a fearful struggle. "I need not tell you to cherish the treasure you will possess. You love her, Heyward; that would conceal 1,000 faults, though she had them. She is kind, gentle, sweet, good, as mortal may be. There is not a blemish in mind or person at which the proudest of you all would sicken. She is fair, oh, how surpassingly fair!" laying her own beautiful but less brilliant hand in melancholy affection on the alabaster forehead of Alice, and parting the golden hair which clustered above her brows. "And yet her soul is pure and spotless as her skin. I would say much, more perhaps than cooler reason would approve, but I will spare you and myself." Her voice became inaudible, and her face was bent over the form of her sister. After a long and burning kiss, she arose, and with features of the hue of death, but without even a tear on her feverish eye, she turned away, and added to the savage, with all her former elevation of manner, "Now, sir, if it be your pleasure, I will follow." "Ay, go!" cried Duncan, placing Alice in the arms of an Indian girl. "Go, Magua, go! These Delawares have their laws, which forbid them to detain you; but I have no such obligation. Go, malignant monster! Why do you delay?" It would be difficult to describe the expression with which Magua listened to this threat to follow. There was at first a fierce and manifest display of joy, and then it was instantly subdued in a look of cunning coldness. "The woods are open," he was content with answering. "The open hand can come." "Hold!" cried Hawkeye, seizing Duncan by the arm, and detaining him by violence. "You know not the craft of the imp. He would lead you to an ambushment and your death." "Huron," interrupted Uncas, who, submissive to the stern customs of his people, had been an attentive and grave listener to all that passed, "Huron, the justice of the Delawares comes from the Manitou. Look at the sun. He is now in the upper branches of the hemlock. Your path is short and open. When he is seen above the trees, there will be men on your trail." "I hear a crow!" exclaimed Magua, with a taunting laugh. "Go!" he added, shaking his hand at the crowd, which had slowly opened to admit his passage. "Where are the petticoats of the Delawares? Let them send their arrows and their guns to the Wyandots. They shall have venison to eat, and corn to hoe. Dogs, rabbits, thieves, I spit on you!" His parting gibes were listened to in a dead and boding silence, and with these biting words in his mouth, the triumphant Magua passed unmolested into the forest, followed by his passive captive, and protected by the inviolable laws of Indian hospitality. Chapter 30.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, Chapter 31. So long as their enemy and his victim continued in sight, the multitude remained motionless as beings charmed to the place by some power that was friendly to the Huron. But the instant he disappeared, it became tossed and agitated by fierce and powerful passion. Uncas maintained his elevated stand, keeping his eyes on the form of Cora, until the colors of her dress were blended with the foliage of the forest, when he descended, and, moving silently through the throng, he disappeared in that lodge from which he had so recently issued. A few of the graver and more attentive warriors, who caught the gleams of anger that shot from the eyes of the young chief in passing, followed him to the place he had selected for his meditations. After which Temenin and Alice were removed, and the women and children were ordered to disperse. During the momentous hour that succeeded, the encampment resembled a hive of troubled bees, who only awaited the appearance and example of their leader to take some distant and momentous flight. A young warrior at length issued from the lodge of Uncas, and, moving deliberately, with a sort of grave march, toward a dwarf pine that grew in the crevices of the rocky terrace, he tore the bark from its body, and then turned whence he came without speaking. He was soon followed by another, who stripped the sapling of its branches, leaving it a naked and blazed trunk. A third colored the post with the stripes of a dark red paint, all which indications of a hostile design in the leaders of the nation were received by the men without in a gloomy and ominous silence. Finally the Mohican himself reappeared, divested of all his attire except his girdle and leggings, and with one half of his fine features hid under a cloud of threatening black. Uncas moved with a slow and dignified tread toward the post, which he immediately commenced encircling with a measured step, not unlike an ancient dance, raising his voice at the same time in the wild and irregular chant of his war song. The notes were in the extremes of human sounds, being sometimes melancholy and exquisitely plaintive, even rivaling the melody of birds, and then by sudden and startling transitions causing the auditors to tremble by their depth and energy. The words were few and often repeated, proceeding gradually from a sort of invocation or hymn to the deity, to an intimation of the warrior's object, and terminating as they commenced with an acknowledgment of his own dependence on the Great Spirit. If it were possible to translate the comprehensive and melodious language in which he spoke, the ode might read something like the following: Manitou, 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 thou art great, thou art good, thou art wise. Manitou, Manitou, thou art just. In the heavens and the clouds, I see many spots, many dark, many red. In the heavens, I see many clouds. In the woods, in the air, I hear the whoop, the long yell, and the cry. In the woods, I hear the loud whoop. Manitou, 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 I am weak, thou art strong. I am slow. Manitou, Manitou, give me aid. At the end of what might be called each verse he made a pause, by raising a note louder and longer than common, that was peculiarly suited to the sentiment just expressed. The first close was solemn, and intended to convey the idea of veneration; the second descriptive, bordering on the alarming; and the third was the well-known and terrific war-whoop, which burst from the lips of the young warrior like a combination of all the frightful sounds of battle. The last was like the first, humble and imploring. 3 times did he repeat this song, and as often did he encircle the post in his dance. At the close of the first turn, a grave and highly esteemed chief of the Lenape followed his example, singing words of his own, however, to music of a similar character. Warrior after warrior enlisted in the dance, until all of any renown and authority were numbered in its mazes. The spectacle now became wildly terrific, the fierce-looking and menacing visages of the chiefs receiving additional power from the appalling strains in which they mingled their guttural tones. Just then Uncas struck his tomahawk deep into the post, and raised his voice in a shout, which might be termed his own battle-cry. The act announced that he had assumed the chief authority in the intended expedition. It was a signal that awakened all the slumbering passions of the nation. 100 youths, who had hitherto been restrained by the diffidence of their years, rushed in a frantic body on the fancied emblem of their enemy, and severed it asunder, splinter by splinter, until nothing remained of the trunk but its roots in the earth. During this moment of tumult, the most ruthless deeds of war were performed on the fragments of the tree, with as much apparent ferocity as if they were the living victims of their cruelty. Some were scalped, some received the keen and trembling axe, and others suffered by thrusts from the fatal knife. In short, the manifestations of zeal and fierce delight were so great and unequivocal that the expedition was declared to be a war of the nation. The instant Uncas had struck the blow, he moved out of the circle and cast his eyes up to the sun, which was just gaining the point when the truce with Magua was to end. The fact was soon announced by a significant gesture, accompanied by a corresponding cry, and the whole of the excited multitude abandoned their mimic warfare with shrill yells of pleasure, to prepare for the more hazardous experiment of the reality. The whole face of the encampment was instantly changed. The warriors, who were already armed and painted, became as still as if they were incapable of any uncommon burst of emotion. On the other hand, the women broke out of the lodges, with the songs of joy and those of lamentation so strangely mixed that it might have been difficult to have said which passion preponderated. None, however, was idle. Some bore their choicest articles, others their young, and some their aged and infirm, into the forest, which spread itself like a verdant carpet of bright green against the side of the mountain. Thither Temenin also retired, with calm composure, after a short and touching interview with Uncas, from whom the sage separated with the reluctance that a parent would quit a long-lost and just-recovered child. In the meantime, Duncan saw Alice to a place of safety, and then sought the scout, with a countenance that denoted how eagerly he also panted for the approaching contest. But Hawkeye was too much accustomed to the war song and the enlistments of the natives to betray any interest in the passing scene. He merely cast an occasional look at the number and quality of the warriors, who from time to time signified their readiness to accompany Uncas to the field. In this particular he was soon satisfied, for, as has been already seen, the power of the young chief quickly embraced every fighting man in the nation. After this material point was so satisfactorily decided, he dispatched an Indian boy in quest of killdeer and the rifle of Uncas to the place where they had deposited their weapons on approaching the camp of the Delawares, a measure of double policy, inasmuch as it protected the arms from their own fate, if detained as prisoners, and gave them the advantage of appearing among the strangers rather as sufferers than as men provided with means of defense and subsistence. In selecting another to perform the office of reclaiming his highly prized rifle, the scout had lost sight of none of his habitual caution. He knew that Magua had not come unattended, and he also knew that Huron spies watched the movements of their new enemies along the whole boundary of the woods. It would, therefore, have been fatal to himself to have attempted the experiment. A warrior would have fared no better, but the danger of a boy would not be likely to commence until after his object was discovered. When Heyward joined him, the scout was coolly awaiting the result of this experiment. The boy, who had been well instructed and was sufficiently crafty, proceeded, with a bosom that was swelling with the pride of such a confidence, and all the hopes of young ambition, carelessly across the clearing to the wood, which he entered at a point of some little distance from the place where the guns were secreted. The instant, however, he was concealed by the foliage of the bushes, his dusky form was to be seen gliding, like that of a serpent, toward the desired treasure. He was successful, and in another moment he appeared flying across the narrow opening that skirted the base of the terrace on which the village stood, with the velocity of an arrow, and bearing a prize in each hand. He had actually gained the crags and was leaping up their sides with incredible activity, when a shot from the woods showed how accurate had been the judgment of the scout. The boy answered it with a feeble but contemptuous shout, and immediately a second bullet was sent after him from another part of the cover. At the next instant he appeared on the level above, elevating his guns in triumph, while he moved with the air of a conqueror toward the renowned hunter who had honored him by so glorious a commission. Notwithstanding the lively interest Hawkeye had taken in the fate of his messenger, he received Killdeer with a satisfaction that, momentarily, drove all other recollections from his mind. After examining the piece with an intelligent eye, and opening and shutting the pan some 10 or 15 times, and trying sundry other equally important experiments on the lock, he turned to the boy, and demanded with great manifestations of kindness if he was hurt. The urchin looked proudly up in his face, but made no reply. "Ah, I see, lad, the knaves have barked your arm," added the scout, taking up the limb of the patient sufferer, across which a deep flesh wound had been made by one of the bullets. "But a little bruised alder will act like a charm. In the meantime I will wrap it in a badge of wampum. You have commenced the business of a warrior early, my brave boy, and are likely to bear a plenty of honorable scars to your grave. I know many young men that have taken scalps who cannot show such a mark as this. Go," having bound up the arm, "you will be a chief." The lad departed, prouder of his flowing blood than the vainest courtier could be of his blushing ribbon, and stalked among the fellows of his age, an object of general admiration and envy. But in a moment of so many serious and important duties, this single act of juvenile fortitude did not attract the general notice and commendation it would have received under milder auspices. It had, however, served to apprise the Delawares of the position and intentions of their enemies. Accordingly, a party of adventurers, better suited to the task than the weak though spirited boy, was ordered to dislodge the skulkers. The duty was soon performed, for most of the Hurons retired of themselves when they found they had been discovered. The Delawares followed to a sufficient distance from their own encampment, and then halted for orders, apprehensive of being led into an ambush. As both parties secreted themselves, the woods were again as still and quiet as a mild summer morning and deep solitude could render them. The calm but still impatient Uncas now collected his chiefs, and divided his power. He presented Hawkeye as a warrior, often tried and always found deserving of confidence. When he found his friend met with a favorable reception, he bestowed on him the command of 20 men, like himself, active, skillful, and resolute. He gave the Delawares to understand the rank of Heyward among the troops of the Yengeese, and then tendered to him a trust of equal authority. But Duncan declined the charge, professing his readiness to serve as a volunteer by the side of the scout. After this disposition, the young Mohican appointed various native chiefs to fill the different situations of responsibility, and, the time pressing, he gave forth the word to march. He was cheerfully but silently obeyed by more than 200 men. Their entrance into the forest was perfectly unmolested, nor did they encounter any living objects that could either give the alarm or furnish the intelligence they needed, until they came upon the lairs of their own scouts. Here a halt was ordered, and the chiefs were assembled to hold a whispering council. At this meeting diverse plans of operation were suggested, though none of a character to meet the wishes of their ardent leader. Had Uncas followed the promptings of his own inclinations, he would have led his followers to the charge without a moment's delay, and put the conflict to the hazard of an instant issue. But such a course would have been in opposition to all the received practices and opinions of his countrymen. He was, therefore, fain to adopt a caution that in the present temper of his mind he execrated, and to listen to advice at which his fiery spirit chafed under the vivid recollection of Cora's danger and Magua's insolence. After an unsatisfactory conference of many minutes, a solitary individual was seen advancing from the side of the enemy, with such apparent haste as to induce the belief he might be a messenger charged with pacific overtures. When within 100 yards, however, of the cover behind which the Delaware council had assembled, the stranger hesitated, appeared uncertain what course to take, and finally halted. All eyes were turned now on Uncas, as if seeking directions how to proceed. "Hawkeye," said the young chief in a low voice, "he must never speak to the Hurons again." "His time has come," said the laconic scout, thrusting the long barrel of his rifle through the leaves and taking his deliberate and fatal aim. but instead of pulling the trigger he lowered the muzzle again, and indulged himself in a fit of his peculiar mirth. "I took the imp for a Mingo, as I'm a miserable sinner," he said, "but when my eye ranged along his ribs for a place to get the bullet in, would you think it, Uncas, I saw the musicianer's blower, and so, after all, it is the man they call Gamut, whose death can profit no one, and whose life, if this tongue can do anything but sing, may be made serviceable to our own ends. If sounds have not lost their virtue, I'll soon have a discourse with the honest fellow, and that in a voice he'll find more agreeable than the speech of Killdeer." So saying, Hawkeye laid aside his rifle, and, crawling through the bushes until within hearing of David, he attempted to repeat the musical effort which had conducted himself with so much safety and éclat through the Huron encampment. The exquisite organs of Gamut could not readily be deceived, and, to say the truth, it would have been difficult for any other than Hawkeye to produce a similar noise. And, consequently, having once before heard the sounds, he now knew whence they proceeded. The poor fellow appeared relieved from a state of great embarrassment, for, pursuing the direction of the voice, a task that to him was not much less arduous than it would have been to have gone up in the face of a battery, he soon discovered the hidden songster. "I wonder what the Hurons will think of that," said the scout, laughing, as he took his companion by the arm and urged him toward the rear. "If the knaves lie within earshot, they will say there are two non-composers instead of one. But here we are safe," he added, pointing to Uncas and his associates. "Now give us the history of the Mingo inventions in natural English, and without any ups and downs of voice." David gazed about him, at the fierce and wild-looking chiefs, in mute wonder. But assured by the presence of faces that he knew, he soon rallied his faculties so far as to make an intelligent reply. "The heathen are abroad in goodly numbers," said David, "and, I fear, with evil intent. There has been much howling and ungodly revelry, together with such sounds as it is profanity to utter, in their habitations within the past hour, so much so, in truth, that I have fled to the Delawares in search of peace." "Your ears might not have profited much by the exchange had you been quicker of foot," returned the scout a little dryly. "But let that be as it may. Where are the Hurons?" "They lie hid in the forest, between this spot and their village, in such force that prudence would teach you instantly to return." Uncas cast a glance along the range of trees which concealed his own band, and mentioned the name of Magua. "Is among them. He brought in the maiden that had sojourned with the Delawares, and, leaving her in the cave, has put himself like a raging wolf at the head of his savages. I know not what has troubled his spirit so greatly." "He has left her, you say, in the cave?" interrupted Heyward. "'Tis well that we know its situation. May not something be done for her instant relief?" Uncas looked earnestly at the scout before he asked, "What says Hawkeye?" "Give me 20 rifles, and I will turn to the right along the stream, and, passing by the huts of the beaver, will join the Sagamore and the colonel. You shall then hear the whoop from that quarter. With this wind one may easily send it a mile. Then, Uncas, do you drive in the front. When they come within range of our pieces, we will give them a blow that, I pledge the good name of an old frontiersman, shall make their line bend like an ashen bow. After which we will carry the village, and take the woman from the cave, when the affair may be finished with the tribe, according to a white man's battle, by a blow and a victory, or, in the Indian fashion, with dodge and cover. There may be no great learning, Major, in this plan, but with courage and patience it can all be done." "I like it very much," cried Duncan, who saw that the release of Cora was the primary object in the mind of the scout. "I like it much. Let it be instantly attempted." After a short conference the plan was matured, and rendered more intelligible to the several parties. The different signals were appointed, and the chiefs separated, each to his allotted station. End of chapter 31.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 32. But plagues shall spread, and funeral fires increase, till the great king, without a ransom paid, to her own Crissa send the black-eyed maid. Pope. During the time Uncas was making this disposition of his forces, the woods were as still, and, with the exception of those who had met in council, apparently as much untenanted as when they came fresh from the hands of their almighty Creator. The eye could range in every direction through the long and shadowed vistas of the trees, but nowhere was any object to be seen that did not properly belong to the peaceful and slumbering scenery. Here and there a bird was heard fluttering among the branches of the beeches, and occasionally a squirrel dropped a nut, drawing the startled looks of the party for a moment to the place. But the instant the casual interruption ceased, the passing air was heard murmuring above their heads, along that verdant and undulating surface of forest, which spread itself unbroken, unless by stream or lake, over such a vast region of country. Across the tract of wilderness which lay between the Delawares and the village of their enemies, it seemed as if the foot of man had never trodden, so breathing and deep was the silence in which it lay. But Hawkeye, whose duty led him foremost in the adventure, knew the character of those with whom he was about to contend too well to trust the treacherous quiet. When he saw his little band collected, the scout threw killdeer into the hollow of his arm, and making a silent signal that he would be followed, he led them many rods toward the rear, into the bed of a little brook which they had crossed in advancing. Here he halted, and after waiting for the whole of his grave and attentive warriors to close about him, he spoke in Delaware, demanding, "Do any of my young men know whither this run will lead us?" A Delaware stretched forth a hand, with the two fingers separated, and indicating the manner in which they were joined at the root, he answered, "Before the sun could go his own length, the little water will be in the big." Then he added, pointing in the direction of the place he mentioned, "The two make enough for the beavers." "I thought as much," returned the scout, glancing his eye upward at the opening in the tree-tops, "from the course it takes, and the bearings of the mountains. Men, we will keep within the cover of its banks, till we scent the Hurons." His companions gave the usual brief exclamation of assent, but, perceiving that their leader was about to lead the way in person, one or two made signs that all was not as it should be. Hawkeye, who comprehended their meaning glances, turned and perceived that his party had been followed thus far by the singing-master. "Do you know, friend," asked the scout, gravely, and perhaps with a little of the pride of conscience deserving in his manner, "that this is a band of rangers chosen for the most desperate service, and put under the command of one who, though another might say it with a better face, will not be apt to leave them idle? It may not be 5, it cannot be 30 minutes, before we tread on the body of a Huron, living or dead." "Though not admonished of your intentions in words," returned David, whose face was a little flushed, and whose ordinarily quiet and unmeaning eyes glimmered with an expression of unusual fire, "your men have reminded me of the children of Jacob going out to battle against the Shechemites, for wickedly aspiring to wedlock with a woman of a race that was favoured of the Lord. Now I have journeyed far, and sojourned much in good and evil with the maiden ye seek, and, though not a man of war, with my loins girded, and my sword sharpened, yet would I gladly strike a blow in her behalf." The scout hesitated, as if weighing the chances of such a strange enlistment in his mind before he answered, "You know not the use of any weapon. You carry no rifle, and believe me, what the Mingos take they will freely give again." "Though not a vaunting and bloodily disposed Goliath," returned David, drawing a sling from beneath his party-coloured and uncouth attire, "I have not forgotten the example of the Jewish boy. With this ancient instrument of war have I practised much in my youth, and peradventure the skill has not entirely departed from me." "Ay," said Hawkeye, considering the deerskin thong and apron with a cold and discouraging eye, "the thing might do its work among arrows, or even knives, but these Mengwe have been furnished by the Frenchers with a good grooved barrel a man. However, it seems to be your gift to go unharmed amid fire, and as you have hitherto been favoured, Major, you have left your rifle at a cock. A single shot before the time would be just 20 scalps lost to no purpose. Singer, you can follow. We may find use for you in the shoutings." "I thank you, friend," returned David, supplying himself, like his royal namesake, from among the pebbles of the brook. "Though not given to the desire to kill, had you sent me away, my spirit would have been troubled." "Remember," added the scout, tapping his own head significantly on that spot where Gamut was yet sore, "we come to fight, and not to musicate. Until the general whoop is given, nothing speaks but the rifle." David nodded, as much to signify his acquiescence with the terms, and then Hawkeye, casting another observant glance over his followers, made the signal to proceed. Their route lay, for the distance of a mile, along the bed of the watercourse. Though protected from any great danger of observation by the precipitous banks, and the thick shrubbery which skirted the stream, no precaution known to an Indian attack was neglected. A warrior rather crawled than walked on each flank, so as to catch occasional glimpses into the forest, and every few minutes the band came to a halt, and listened for hostile sounds, with an acuteness of organs that would be scarcely conceivable to a man in a less natural state. Their march was, however, unmolested, and they reached the point where the lesser stream was lost in the greater, without the smaller evidence that their progress had been noted. Here the scout again halted, to consult the signs of the forest. "We are likely to have a good day for a fight," he said, in English, addressing Heyward, and glancing his eyes upward at the clouds, which began to move in broad sheets across the firmament. "A bright sun and a glittering barrel are no friends to true sight. Everything is favourable. They have the wind, which will bring down their noises, and their smoke, too, no little matter in itself, whereas with us it will be first a shot, and then a clear view. But here is an end to our cover. The beavers have had the range of this stream for hundreds of years, and what atween their food and their dams, there is, as you see, many a girdled stub, but few living trees." Hawkeye had, in truth, in these few words, given no bad description of the prospect that now lay in their front. The brook was irregular in its width, sometimes shooting through narrow fissures in the rocks, and at others spreading over acres of bottom land, forming little areas that might be termed ponds. Everywhere along its bands were the mouldering relics of dead trees, in all the stages of decay, from those that groaned on their tottering trunks to such as had recently been robbed of those rugged coats that so mysteriously contain their principle of life. A few long, low, and moss-covered piles were scattered among them, like the memorials of a former and long-departed generation. All these minute particulars were noted by the scout, with a gravity and interest that they probably had never before attracted. He knew that the Huron encampment lay a short half-mile up the brook, and, with the characteristic anxiety of one who dreaded a hidden danger, he was greatly troubled at not finding the smallest trace of the presence of his enemy. Once or twice he felt induced to give the order for a rush, and to attempt the village by surprise, but his experience quickly admonished him of the danger of so useless an experiment. Then he listened intently, and with painful uncertainty, for the sounds of hostility in the quarter where Uncas was left, but nothing was audible except the sighing of the wind that began to sweep over the bosom of the forest in gusts which threatened a tempest. At length, yielding rather to his unusual impatience than taking counsel from his knowledge, he determined to bring matters to an issue by unmasking his force and proceeding cautiously but steadily up the stream. The scout had stood, while making his observations, sheltered by a brake, and his companions still lay in the bed of the ravine, through which the smaller stream debouched. But on hearing his low, though intelligible signal, the whole party stole up the bank, like so many dark spectres, and silently arranged themselves around him. Pointing in the direction he wished to proceed, Hawkeye advanced, the band breaking off in single files, and following so accurately in his footsteps as to leave it, if we except Heyward and David, the trail of but a single man. The party was, however, scarcely uncovered before a volley from a dozen rifles was heard in their rear, and a Delaware, leaping high into the air like a wounded deer, fell at his whole length, dead. "Ah, I feared some deviltry like this," exclaimed the scout in English, adding, with the quickness of thought in his adopted tongue, "To cover, men, and charge!" The band dispersed at the word, and before Heyward had well recovered from his surprise, he found himself standing alone with David. Luckily the Hurons had already fallen back, and he was safe from their fire. But this state of things was evidently to be of short continuance, for the scout set the example of pressing on their retreat, by discharging his rifle, and darting from tree to tree as his enemy slowly yielded ground. It would seem that the assault had been made by a very small party of the Hurons, which, however, continued to increase in numbers as it retired on its friends, until the return fire was very nearly, if not quite, equal to that maintained by the advancing Delawares. Heyward threw himself among the combatants, and, imitating the necessary caution of his companions, he made quick discharges with his own rifle. The contest now grew warm and stationary. Few were injured, as both parties kept their bodies as much protected as possible by the trees, never indeed exposing any part of their persons except in the act of taking aim. But the chances were gradually growing unfavourable to Hawkeye and his band. The quick-sighted scout perceived his danger without knowing how to remedy it. He saw it was more dangerous to retreat than to maintain his ground, while he found his enemy throwing out men on his flank, which rendered the task of keeping themselves covered so very difficult to the Delawares as nearly to silence their fire. At this embarrassing moment, when they began to think the whole of the hostile tribe was gradually encircling them, they heard the yell of combatants and the rattling of arms echoing under the arches of the wood at the place where Uncas was posted, a bottom which, in a manner, lay beneath the ground on which Hawkeye and his party were contending. The effects of this attack were instantaneous, and to the scout and his friends greatly relieving. It would seem that, while his own surprise had been anticipated, and had consequently failed, the enemy, in their turn, having been deceived in its object and in his numbers, had left too small a force to resist the impetuous onset of the young Mohican. This fact was doubly apparent by the rapid manner in which the battle in the forest rolled upward toward the village, and by an instant falling off in the number of their assailants, who rushed to assist in maintaining the front, and, as it now proved to be, the principal point of defence. Animating his followers by his voice and his own example, Hawkeye then gave the word to bear down upon their foes. The charge, in that rude species of warfare, consisted merely in pushing from cover to cover, nigher to the enemy, and in this maneuver he was instantly and successfully obeyed. The Hurons were compelled to withdraw, and the scene of the contest rapidly changed from the more open ground on which it had commenced, to a spot where the assailed found a thicket to rest upon. Here the struggle was protracted, arduous, and seemingly of doubtful issue, the Delawares, though none of them fell, beginning to bleed freely, in consequence of the disadvantage at which they were held. In this crisis, Hawkeye found means to get behind the same tree as that which served for a cover to Heyward, most of his own combatants being within call, a little on his right, where they maintained rapid, though fruitless, discharges on their sheltered enemies. "You are a young man, Major," said the scout, dropping the butt of killdeer to the earth, and leaning on his barrel, a little fatigued with his previous industry, "and it may be your gift to lead armies, at some future day, agin these imps, the Mingos. You may here see the philosophy of an Indian fight. It consists mainly in ready hand, a quick eye, and a good cover. Now, if you had a company of the Royal Americans here, in what manner would you set them to work in this business?" "The bayonet would make a road." "Ay, there is white reason in what you say, but a man must ask himself, in this wilderness, how many lives he can spare. No, horse," continued the scout, shaking his head like one who mused, "horse, I am ashamed to say, must sooner or later decide these scrimmages. The brutes are better than men, and to horse must we come at last. Put a shodden hoof on the moccasin of a redskin, and if his rifle be once emptied, he will never stop to load it again." Note: the American forest admits of the passage of horses, there being little underbrush and few tangled brakes. The plan of Hawkeye is the one which has always proved the most successful in the battles between the whites and the Indians. Wayne, in his celebrated campaign on the Miami, received the fire of his enemies in line, and then causing his dragoons to wheel round his flanks, the Indians were driven from their covers before they had time to load. One of the most conspicuous of the chiefs who fought in the battle of Miami assured the writer that the red men could not fight the warriors with long knives and leather stockings, meaning the dragoons with their sabres and boots. "This is a subject that might better be discussed at another time," returned Heyward. "Shall we charge?" "I see no contradiction to the gifts of any man in passing his breathing spells in useful reflections," the scout replied. "As to rush, I little relish such a measure, for a scalp or two must be thrown away in the attempt. And yet," he added, bending his head aside, to catch the sounds of the distant combat, "if we are to be of use to Uncas, these knaves in our front must be got rid of." Then, turning with a prompt and decided air, he called aloud to his Indians in their own language. His words were answered by a shout, and, at a given signal, each warrior made a swift movement around his particular tree. The sight of so many dark bodies, glancing before their eyes at the same instant, drew a hasty and consequently an ineffectual fire from the Hurons. Without stopping to breathe, the Delawares leaped in long bounds toward the wood, like so many panthers springing upon their prey. Hawkeye was in front, brandishing his terrible rifle, and animating his followers by his example. A few of the older and more cunning Hurons, who had not been deceived by the artifice which had been practised to draw their fire, now made a close and deadly discharge of their pieces, and justified the apprehensions of the scout by felling 3 of his foremost warriors. But the shock was insufficient to repel the impetus of the charge. The Delawares broke into the cover with the ferocity of their natures, and swept away every trace of resistance by the fury of the onset. The combat endured only for an instant, hand to hand, and then the assailed yielded ground rapidly, until they reached the opposite margin of the thicket, where they clung to the cover, with the sort of obstinacy that is so often witnessed in hunted brutes. At this critical moment, when the success of the struggle was again becoming doubtful, the crack of a rifle was heard behind the Hurons, and a bullet came whizzing from among some beaver lodges, which were situated in the clearing in their rear, and was followed by the fierce and appalling yell of the war-whoop. "There speaks the Sagamore!" shouted Hawkeye, answering the cry with his own stentorian voice. "We have them now in face and back." The effect on the Hurons was instantaneous. Discouraged by an assault from a quarter that left them no opportunity for cover, the warriors uttered a common yell of disappointment, and breaking off in a body, they spread themselves across the opening, heedless of every consideration but flight. Many fell in making the experiment under the bullets and the blows of the pursuing Delawares. We shall not pause to detail the meeting between the scout and Chingachgook, or the more touching interview that Duncan held with Munro. A few brief and hurried words served to explain the state of things to both parties, and then Hawkeye, pointing out the Sagamore to his band, resigned the chief authority into the hands of the Mohican chief. Chingachgook assumed the station to which his birth and experience gave him so distinguished a claim, with the grave dignity that always gives force to the mandates of a native warrior. Following the footsteps of the scout, he led the party back through the thicket, his men scalping the fallen Hurons, and secreting the bodies of their own dead as they proceeded, until they gained a point where the former was content to make a halt. The warriors, who had breathed themselves freely in the preceding struggle, were now posted on a bit of level ground, sprinkled with trees in sufficient numbers to conceal them. The land fell away rather precipitately in front, and beneath their eyes stretched, for several miles, a narrow, dark, and wooded vale. It was through this dense and dark forest that Uncas was still contending with the main body of the Hurons. The Mohican and his friends advanced to the brow of the hill, and listened with practised ears to the sounds of the combat. A few birds hovered over the leafy bosom of the valley, frightened from their secluded nests, and here and there a light vapoury cloud, which seemed already blending with the atmosphere, arose above the trees, and indicated some spot where the struggle had been fierce and stationary. "The fight is coming up the ascent," said Duncan, pointing in the direction of a new explosion of firearms. "We are too much in the centre of their line to be effective." "They will incline into the hollow, where the cover is thicker," said the scout, "and that will leave us well on their flank. Go, Sagamore. You will hardly be in time to give the whoop, and lead on the young men. I will fight this scrimmage with warriors of my own colour. You know me, Mohican. Not a Huron of them all shall cross the swell into your rear without the notice of Killdeer." The Indian chief paused another moment to consider the signs of the contest, which was now rolling rapidly up the ascent, a certain evidence that the Delawares triumphed. Nor did he actually quit the place until admonished of the proximity of his friends, as well as enemies, by the bullets of the former, which began to patter among the dried leaves on the ground, like the bits of falling hail which precede the bursting of the tempest. Hawkeye and his 3 companions withdrew a few paces to a shelter, and awaited the issue with calmness that nothing but great practice could impart in such a scene. It was not long before the reports of the rifles began to lose the echoes of the woods, and to sound like weapons discharged in the open air. Then a warrior appeared, here and there, driven to the skirts of the forest, and rallying as he entered the clearing, as at the place where the final stand was to be made. These were soon joined by others, until a long line of swarthy figures was to be seen clinging to the cover with the obstinacy of desperation. Hayward began to grow impatient, and turned his eyes anxiously in the direction of Chingachgook. The chief was seated on a rock, with nothing visible but his calm visage, considering the spectacle with an eye as deliberate as if he were posted there merely to view the struggle. "The time has come for the Delaware to strike," said Duncan. "Not so, not so," returned the scout. "When he sends his friends, he will let them know that he is here. See, the knaves are getting in that clump of pines, like bees settling after their flight. By the Lord, a squaw might put a bullet into the centre of such a knot of dark skins." At that instant the whoop was given, and a dozen Hurons fell by a discharge from Chingachgook and his band. The shout that followed was answered by a single war cry from the forest, and a yell passed through the air that sounded as if 1,000 throats were united in a common effort. The Hurons staggered, deserting the centre of their line, and Uncas issued from the forest through the opening they left, at the head of 100 warriors. Waving his hands right and left, the young chief pointed out the enemy to his followers, who separated in pursuit. The war now divided, both wings of the broken Hurons seeking protection in the woods again, hotly pressed by the victorious warriors of the Lenape. A minute might have passed, but the sounds were already proceeding in different directions, and gradually losing their distinctness beneath the echoing arches of the woods. One little knot of Hurons, however, had disdained to seek a cover, and were retiring, like lions at bay, slowly and sullenly up the acclivity which Chingachgook and his band had just deserted, to mingle more closely in the fray. Magua was conspicuous in this party, both by his fierce and savage mien, and by the air of haughty authority he yet maintained. In his eagerness to expedite the pursuit, Uncas had left himself nearly alone, but the moment his eye caught the figure of Le Subtil, every other consideration was forgotten. Raising his cry of battle, which recalled some 6 or 7 warriors, and reckless of the disparity of their numbers, he rushed upon his enemy. Le Renard, who watched the movement, paused to receive him with secret joy. But at the moment when he thought the rashness of his impetuous young assailant had left him at his mercy, another shout was given, and La Longue Carabine was seen rushing to the rescue, attended by all his white associates. The Huron instantly turned, and commenced a rapid retreat up the ascent. There was no time for greetings or congratulations, for Uncas, though unconscious of the presence of his friends, continued the pursuit with the velocity of the wind. In vain Hawkeye called to him to respect the covers. The young Mohican braved the dangerous fire of his enemies, and soon compelled them to a flight as swift as his own headlong speed. It was fortunate that the race was of short continuance, and that the white men were much favored by their position, or the Delaware would soon have outstripped all his companions, and fallen a victim to his own temerity. But, ere such a calamity could happen, the pursuers and pursued entered the Wyandot village, within striking distance of each other. Excited by the presence of their dwellings, and tired of the chase, the Hurons now made a stand, and fought around their council lodge with the fury of despair. The onset and the issue were like the passage and destruction of a whirlwind. The tomahawk of Uncas, the blows of Hawkeye, and even the still nervous arm of Munro were all busy for that passing moment, and the ground was quickly strewed with their enemies. Still Magua, though daring and much exposed, escaped from every effort against his life, with that sort of fabled protection that was made to overlook the fortunes of favored heroes in the legends of ancient poetry. Raising a yell that spoke volumes of anger and disappointment, the subtle chief, when he saw his comrades fallen, darted away from the place, attended by his two only surviving friends, leaving the Delawares engaged in stripping the dead of the bloody trophies of their victory. But Uncas, who had vainly sought him in the melee, bounded forward in pursuit, Hawkeye, Heyward, and David still pressing on his footsteps. The utmost that the scout could effect was to keep the muzzle of his rifle a little in advance of his friend, to whom, however, it answered every purpose of a charmed shield. Once Magua appeared disposed to make another and a final effort to revenge his losses, but, abandoning his intention as soon as demonstrated, he leaped into a thicket of bushes, through which he was followed by his enemies, and suddenly entered the mouth of the cave already known to the reader. Hawkeye, who had only forborne to fire in tenderness to Uncas, raised a shout of success, and proclaimed aloud that now they were certain of their game. The pursuers dashed into the long and narrow entrance, in time to catch a glimpse of the retreating forms of the Hurons. Their passage through the natural galleries and subterraneous apartments of the cavern was preceded by the shrieks and cries of hundreds of women and children. The place, seen by its dim and uncertain light, appeared like the shades of the infernal regions, across which unhappy ghosts and savage demons were flitting in multitudes. Still Uncas kept his eye on Magua, as if life to him possessed but a single object. Heyward and the scout still pressed on his rear, actuated, though possibly in a less degree, by a common feeling. But their way was becoming intricate in those dark and gloomy passages, and the glimpses of the retiring warriors less distinct and frequent, and for a moment the trace was believed to be lost, when a white robe was seen fluttering in the further extremity of a passage that seemed to lead up the mountain. "'Tis Cora!" exclaimed Heyward, in a voice in which horror and delight were wildly mingled. "Cora! Cora!" echoed Uncas, bounding forward like a deer. "'Tis the maiden!" shouted the scout. "Courage, lady! We come! We come!" The chase was renewed with a diligence rendered tenfold encouraging by this glimpse of the captive, but the way was rugged, broken, and in spots nearly impassable. Uncas abandoned his rifle, and leaped forward with headlong precipitation. Heyward rashly imitated his example, though both were, a moment afterward, admonished of his madness by hearing the bellowing of a piece that the Hurons found time to discharge down the passage in the rocks, the bullet from which even gave the young Mohican a slight wound. "We must close," said the scout, passing his friends by a desperate leap. "The knaves will pick us all off at this distance. And see, they hold the maiden so as to shield themselves." Though his words were unheeded, or rather unheard, his example was followed by his companions, who, by incredible exertions, got near enough to the fugitives to perceive that Cora was borne along between the two warriors, while Magua prescribed the direction and manner of their flight. At this moment the forms of all four were strongly drawn against an opening in the sky, and they disappeared. Nearly frantic with disappointment, Uncas and Heyward increased efforts that already seemed superhuman, and they issued from the cavern on the side of the mountain, in time to note the route of the pursued. The course lay up the ascent, and still continued hazardous and laborious. Encumbered by his rifle, and perhaps not sustained by so deep an interest in the captive as his companions, the scout suffered the latter to precede him a little, Uncas in his turn taking the lead of Heyward. In this manner, rocks, precipices, and difficulties were surmounted in an incredibly short space, that at another time, and under other circumstances, would have been deemed almost insuperable. But the impetuous young men were rewarded by finding that, encumbered with Cora, the Hurons were losing ground in the race. "Stay, dog of the Wyandots!" exclaimed Uncas, shaking his bright tomahawk at Magua. "A Delaware girl calls stay!" "I will go no further," cried Cora, stopping unexpectedly on a ledge of rock that overhung a deep precipice, at no great distance from the summit of the mountain. "Kill me if thou wilt, detestable Huron! I will go no further." The supporters of the maiden raised their ready tomahawks with the impious joy that fiends are thought to take in mischief, but Magua stayed the uplifted arms. The Huron chief, after casting the weapons he had wrested from his companions over the rock, drew his knife, and turned to his captive, with a look in which conflicting passions fiercely contended. "Woman," he said, "choose, the wigwam or the knife of Le Subtil." Cora regarded him not, but dropping on her knees, she raised her eyes and stretched her arms toward heaven, saying in a meek and yet confiding voice, "I am thine. Do with me as thou seest best." "Woman," repeated Magua, hoarsely, and endeavoring in vain to catch a glance from her serene and beaming eye, "choose." But Cora neither heard nor heeded his demand. The form of the Huron trembled in every fibre, and he raised his arm on high, but dropped it again with a bewildered air, like one who doubted. Once more he struggled with himself, and lifted the keen weapon again. But just then a piercing cry was heard above them, and Uncas appeared, leaping frantically from a fearful height upon the ledge. Magua recoiled a step, and one of his assistants, profiting by the chance, sheathed his own knife in the bosom of Cora. The Huron sprang like a tiger on his offending and already retreating countryman, but the falling form of Uncas separated the unnatural combatants. Diverted from his object by this interruption, and maddened by the murder he had just witnessed, Magua buried his weapon in the back of the prostrate Delaware, uttering an unearthly shout as he committed the dastardly deed. But Uncas arose from the blow, as the wounded panther turns upon his foe, and struck the murderer of Cora to his feet, by an effort in which the last of his failing strength was expended. Then, with a stern and steady look, he turned to Le Subtil, and indicated by the expression of his eye all that he would do had not the power deserted him. The latter seized the nerveless arm of the unresisting Delaware, and passed his knife into his bosom 3 several times, before his victim, still keeping his gaze riveted on his enemy, with a look of inextinguishable scorn, fell dead at his feet. "Mercy! Mercy! Huron!" cried Heyward from above, in tones nearly choked by horror. "Give mercy, and thou shalt receive from it." Whirling the bloody knife up at the imploring youth, the victorious Magua uttered a cry so fierce, so wild, and yet so joyous, that it conveyed the sounds of savage triumph to the ears of those who fought in the valley 1,000 feet below. He was answered by a burst from the lips of the scout, whose tall person was just then seen moving swiftly toward him along those dangerous crags, with steps as bold and reckless as if he possessed the power to move in air. But when the hunter reached the scene of the ruthless massacre, the ledge was tenanted only by the dead. His keen eye took a single look at the victims, and then shot its glances over the difficulties of the ascent in his front. A form stood at the brow of the mountain, on the very edge of the giddy height, with uplifted arms, in an awful attitude of menace. Without stopping to consider his person, the rifle of Hawkeye was raised, but a rock, which fell on the head of one of the fugitives below, exposed the indignant and glowing countenance of the honest Gamut. Then Magua issued from a crevice, and, stepping with calm indifference over the body of the last of his associates, he leaped a wide fissure, and ascended the rocks at a point where the arm of David could not reach him. A single bound would carry him to the brow of the precipice, and assure his safety. Before taking the leap, however, the Huron paused, and shaking his hand at the scout, he shouted, "The pale-faces are dogs, the Delawares women. Magua leaves them on the rocks for the crows." Laughing hoarsely, he made a desperate leap, and fell short of his mark, though his hands grabbed a shrub on the verge of the height. The form of Hawkeye had crouched like a beast about to take its spring, and his frame trembled so violently with eagerness that the muzzle of the half-raised rifle played like a leaf fluttering in the wind. Without exhausting himself with fruitless efforts, the cunning Magua suffered his body to drop to the length of his arms, and found a fragment for his feet to rest on. Then, summoning all his powers, he renewed the attempt, and so far succeeded as to draw his knees on the edge of the mountain. It was now, when the body of his enemy was most collected together, that the agitated weapon of the scout was drawn to his shoulder. The surrounding rocks themselves were not steadier than the piece became, for the single instant that it poured out its contents. The arms of the Huron relaxed, and his body fell back a little, while his knees still kept their position. Turning a relentless look on his enemy, he shook a hand in grim defiance. But his hold loosened, and his dark person was seen cutting the air with its head downward for a fleeting instant, until it glided past the fringe of shrubbery which clung to the mountain in its rapid flight to destruction. End of chapter 32.